Part of the job of the United States Treasury agent is to protect the integrity of the U.S. currency. And a few years ago, I learned that Treasury agents rigorously trained using only real money. Think about that for a second. They don't bother to handle counterfeits, just real money. All the levels of the currency, but real currency. A Treasury agent does not study lists of known counterfeiting techniques because that information would be incomplete at one point or another, and eventually it becomes irrelevant because counterfeiters get better and they move on, and the data becomes outdated. Rather, a Treasury agent spends their time with the real thing. So they know what the weight of the currency is. They know what the actual appearance of the currency is. They even know the smell of real money. Some of you, I'm getting all excited as we talk about money. But we're not going to talk about it much. I just want you to know that when a counterfeiter throws a new deception to try to disrupt the U.S. currency, the Treasury agent can immediately detect it, because he or she is so well versed in the real deal, the actual currency, real money. Well, you know, the Apostle Paul advises a similar approach when it comes to living this life as Christians. In 1 Corinthians 11:1, he says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I wonder if you would repeat that verse with me. Will you do that? Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Paul was coaching the Corinthian Christians that the secret to a life well lived, the key to an influential life, is found in focusing on the real deal, focusing on Jesus himself. And like a counterfeiter trying to pass phony money off, the world tries to convince the Christian that there are better ways to live than following after Jesus. But Paul says, keep your eyes on the real thing. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So I want to propose this morning that if you desire to have your value clearly defined by God, then keep your focus on Jesus. No matter what happens in this life, keep your focus on Jesus. No matter how difficult and challenging your existence may be, never take your eyes off of Jesus. No matter what happens, keep your eyes on him. Now, there's going to be storms that will come that will test us to the very core, especially if you follow Christ for any length of time in your life. You'll find that the enemy doesn't like that. And so he'll try to create disruptions in your life. And there'll be times along the way where God will allow those storms to come. Whatever the case is, when your core is tested, keep your eyes on Jesus. We'll see through this study that we're going to look at in Matthew, the 14th chapter this morning, that when you put our focus on anything else, we will eventually find ourselves sinking. You see, just like the counterfeit, Jesus is the only sustainable focus for the Christian. As opposed to counterfeit money, it'll always be found eventually. But Jesus is the real deal. He's not a counterfeit. If we keep our focus on him, he will see us through every storm that you and I will face. So if you have a Bible and you want to follow along, Matthew, the 14th chapter is what we're going to be using as our text this morning, starting with verse 22. And the story starts with Jesus trying to hurry the crowd away. And we don't see Jesus in a hurry very often. But he's just fed 5,000 men plus women and children on this hillside. He's been teaching there prior to that. And now he's dismissing the crowd, and he sends his disciples off to the boat that they had down on the Sea of Galilee. He sends them off. Now the crowd, we find in a parallel passage in John, the 6th chapter, verses 14 and 15, we find that the crowd wanted to make Jesus king. And so Jesus is having none of that. He knew that the purposes that this crowd had were not the purposes of God. This was not God's will for Jesus to become king at this point. If the disciples had stayed there, there's a good possibility they would have fallen right in and been swayed by the plans of this crowd. So at this point, the disciples, they really didn't fully understand the purposes that Jesus had, the plans that were the plans for Jesus. They didn't understand those. So Jesus sends the disciples. He says, go get in the boat, head on out. And then Jesus went up on the hillside to pray. We jump to verse 24. Verse 24 says, the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. Now, it's pretty common for storms to erupt rather quickly on the Sea of Galilee, and a number of the disciples who were in the boat had been men who made their living on this Sea of Galilee. They were fishermen, so they were not surprised by it, but apparently the intensity of the storm caused fear to take place in the boat. One reality about this story that I think is really important for us to recognize is the experience that the disciples had in the storm can be a great encouragement to those of us when we go through the storms of life. Storms happen more than we really care to account and recognize. And I'm not just talking about tornadoes and hurricanes. I'm talking about storms that are personal in our lives. Storms like cancer, trouble in our marriage, the loss of a job, problems with a child, loneliness, rejection. Storms like those can blow into our lives and leave us devastated. Some of you know that all too well. And the results of storms like that have the capacity to define us if we allow them to. When these storms roll through our world, we can feel devalued, we can feel minimized, sometimes we even feel worthless, unless we can keep our focus properly fixed on Jesus. Because the definition and the value and all that he brings to the middle of the storm that we're in is far more significant than if we just try to go through it ourselves. So this morning, I want us to take a few moments to look at how these disciples were ministered to by Jesus in the midst of the storm. Because when we find ourselves in a storm, we can rest on the same assurances that they had. I want to share 4 of those with you this morning. The first one is this: Jesus brought us here. Jesus brought us here. No storm in your life is a surprise to him. Did you realize that? It's not like God is sitting at his desk in heaven and he's got all these computer screens wrapped around the desk giving him weather reports and status reports from all over the universe. And he goes, oh my goodness, there's a storm in your life. And he starts wringing his hands wondering what he's going to do about it. That's just not a reality. The storm the disciples encountered came because they were in the will of God. Not all storms come because we are in the will of God. Some come as a result of the fact that we're not in the will of God. Jonah is a perfect example. The prophet of God was told, go to Nineveh, and he went basically in the opposite direction. He got on a ship and he headed out to sea. Had he gone to Nineveh, he never would have had to board a ship. From where he was, he could have easily traveled there on dry land. He went in opposition to where God had called him to go. And you might remember that when the men who were on that ship, in trying to figure out why this storm was wrecking their lives, they asked, why has this happened to us? And Jonah was like, it's me. It's me. He said, just throw me over the side. And so they said, are you sure? And he said, yeah. And so they did. I would never want to travel on that cruise line, okay? Something goes wrong, they say, I think it's him, he's a preacher, and they're throwing you over the side. And all of a sudden the sea calms. And you know the rest of the story. He's swallowed by a large fish and spends a little time inside the belly of that that animal, and then the next thing you know, he's on the seashore, wiping off fish spit off of himself, and he went to Nineveh, and the whole city repented. This wasn't about Jonah as much as it was about God, but it was about Jonah. God uses storms like that. God used storm to get Jonah's attention. Did Jesus know, though, that this storm was coming? You bet he did. The one that the disciples encountered, he knew it exactly. He did it deliberately to direct them into that storm. He did that. If he knew the storm was coming and he said, get in the boat and head out across the Sea of Galilee, he knew it and he deliberately sent them into the middle of it. The question is, why? Keep in mind that those disciples were safer in a boat in the middle of a storm in God's will than they were on the dry land with a bunch of people who were not in God's will. That's hard for us sometimes to recognize because we think it's safer just if we're just looking at the statistics and the details of this thing, safer on dry land than it is on water. But when you factor God into this equation, they were far safer out there in the middle of the storm than they would have been had they stayed on that hillside with those 5,000 men plus women and children. The best place to be, always, is where God wants you to be. Now, you may not always know that, but if you can discern what God is calling you to, that's the best place to be. As you and I read the Bible, we'll discover there are two basic kinds of storms, and I've talked about them just a little bit here. The first is storms of correction. When God disciplines us, he uses these storms to wake us up or to get our attention or reveal our disobedience. That was the storm Jonah was in. The second is storms of growth, when God helps us deepen our faith through a storm in our lives. Jonah, as I said, was in a storm because he disobeyed God and had to be corrected. The disciples were in a storm because they obeyed Jesus, and Jesus gave them that storm to grow their faith. And I think you'll see that as we get into this story. There's one caveat to this. I think many Christ followers make a mistake in the fact that obedience to God's will produces smooth sailing always. And that's just not the case. In fact, Jesus said in John 16, in this world you will have trouble. He goes on later to say that, if they didn't like me, they're not going to like you. That's the Monty paraphrase. It's free. I'm here all morning long, okay? If they didn't like him and we're his followers, guess what? They're not going to like us. And he's not just talking about the people of this world, but the truth of the matter is he's talking about all the spiritual battle that we're in. Think about it. He was specifically pointing to the people around. The truth is that if you're not following Christ, you're really not a threat in the spiritual battle. But the minute you start to follow him, there will be times when the enemy's going to take some shots at you. In this world, you will have trouble. And when we find ourselves in a storm because we have obeyed the Lord, we must remember that he brought us here and he can care for us in that moment. This is not a surprise to him. Now, the second assurance that we find here is Jesus will come to us. We see that in this story. Oftentimes, we feel like Jesus has deserted us when we're going through difficult times or hard times in our lives. In Psalms, David, the great king of Israel, complained because he felt that God seemed far away to him and unconcerned about him. Now, he knew that God would ultimately rescue him, but he still kind of complained about it. That's David, a man after God's own heart, the Bible says. Even the Apostle Paul got into a situation that was so difficult that he writes in 2 Corinthians, the first chapter, he says, burdened excessively beyond our strength so that we despaired even of life. He's saying, we're so pressured and stressed to the point of death. Where's God? Jesus always comes to us in the storms of life. He may not come when we think he should, but remember, he knows when we will need him the most. I was 5 years old. My parents bought a new house. It was 3 doors down from the elementary school. I really want to thank them for putting me that close to a school. I'm over it. My therapist said I'm making great progress. But we grew up, and at the end of our street was a soybean field in central Iowa. You had a real good possibility, if you lived on the outskirts of town, to being close to a soybean field or a cornfield. It was just the beauty of our neighborhood. And some guys said that they saw some dog food in the bean field, and that meant there was a dog down there. And so we went down there. I was 5, and this was in a time when you'd send your kids out to play, and you didn't worry about them being scooped up, right? So I'm down there, and I'm looking for this dog, and all of a sudden, my friends, I can't find them. And the beans grow pretty high, and I'm only 5 years old, so I can't see over the rows. I don't see any dog. I don't see my friends. But I remember something that my Sunday school teacher told me. She said, Jesus is always with you. And in my mind, I had that kind of that airbrushed, flowing-haired Jesus, standing at the door knocking, the little softer Jesus kind of looking thing. Not the Jesus of, the Passion of the Christ or that picture. I had this really nice Jesus in my mind, and I kept thinking, he is with me. I'm 5. So I kept doing this. Where is he? Because I knew he was behind me because I couldn't see him, and I thought I would trick him, right? Truth is, eventually I heard my parents, all that spinning around just made me even more messed up as to where I was in the bean field. I heard my mom, dad calling me, and eventually I got out of the bean field. I wish I could tell you that later in life, when I got smarter, understood more about who Jesus was, that when the difficult times came, that I would remember that he was with me. And I haven't always done that. Jesus waited until the boat was far enough away from the shore so that all human hope would be exhausted. There would not be a solution that would be human-oriented when the boat was saved. It would all be about him. He's testing the disciples' faith, and thus he's removing all human options, and it's then that Jesus goes to them. Now the question is, why didn't they recognize him when they saw him? And the truth is, they weren't looking for him. He had just fed 5,000 people. They had seen him calm the Sea of Galilee before. But when they see something walking their way, they don't immediately think it's Jesus. They weren't looking for him. Had they been waiting by faith, they would have known him immediately, but instead they jumped to this false conclusion that the appearance or this being that they saw is just an aberration, it's a ghost. It's very, very common that these men who had made their living on the sea were very superstitious. A number of these guys in the boat were fishermen, and they were superstitious. So when they saw Jesus walking, they didn't think it was Jesus. They thought it was a ghost, and they were terrified. Fear and faith cannot live in the same heart. If they're both there, fear always blinds the eyes to the presence of the Lord. You ever been afraid in this journey? What does it do? It takes our eyes off of Jesus real quickly, doesn't it? Fear always blinds us to the things of God, to having our focus on him. Well, Jesus, he will come to us in the midst of the storm. The third assurance that we see here is Jesus will help us grow. You might find this as an odd statement here, but this was the whole purpose of this storm, was to help the disciples to grow in their faith. Who's the focus here? It's Jesus. After all, Jesus would one day leave them, and they would have to face storms in their ministry all by themselves, so to speak. Jesus wouldn't be there physically. Oh, the Spirit of God would be in them, and they would find great confidence in the Spirit of God. But the presence, the physical presence of Jesus would be gone. They had to learn to trust him, even though it looked like he didn't care for him or he wasn't there. The disciples saw someone walking across the water towards them, and they thought that it was a ghost, as I said. But Jesus immediately announces in verse 27, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." That probably had a bit of a calming effect. The storm is still raging, but they've heard that voice, and they track that that's Jesus. It's not a ghost. And it impacts Peter so much that something really amazing happens. He says, "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Jesus said, "Come." And then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. I think this is a magnificent demonstration of faith. I mean, Peter is one of those guys that gets criticized a lot throughout Scripture because he oftentimes speaks or acts before he thinks. He's got that size 12 sandal in his mouth a lot of the time, regretting, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that," you know. He's known for denying even knowing Jesus during Jesus' trial before the crucifixion. But Peter's faith is remarkable here. He heard Jesus' voice. He asked him, "If it's you, tell me to come." And Jesus says, "Come on." And Peter walks on water. Peter dared to be different. He dared to obey what God was saying, even in the face of what, his critics could easily have said, "That's not logical. That's crazy. That's crazy. Walking on water." Nobody walks on water. And Peter, of all people, had made his living on the water. Should have known that. But Jesus said, "Come." And the faith test that day, Peter passed. The irony is that anybody can sit in the boat and watch. And it takes a person of real faith to leave the boat and risk walking on water. And let me caution you in one sense. Someone takes a step they feel God is calling them to. It may be bold, it may be courageous, and in fact, in your assessment, it may be crazy. But tread lightly, because the guys in the boat could easily, based on logic, said, "Peter, you're nuts." It still didn't discredit the fact that Peter walked on water that day. If God's calling you, you better pay attention to that. And there will always be people in the boat who will say, "You shouldn't do that. That's foolishness. That'll never work. You're going to fail." But if your eyes are on Jesus and he's truly calling you to walk on water, you better pay close attention to that. Don't be one of those people in the boat who's trying to keep Peter from walking on the water. Peter's walk was very short. He walked on water, but it wasn't long. It wasn't long. He starts to sink, the Bible says. What caused him to sink? Verse 30 says, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. He cried out, 'Lord, save me.' His faith began to waver because he took his eyes off of Jesus. He began to look at the circumstances around him. The wind distracted him from focusing on Jesus, and it caused him to sink. He's probably looking around, and he's been caught up in the moment, and he's focused on Jesus, and he's laser focused on Jesus. And he gets out of the boat, and then all of a sudden there's this big gust of wind, and he looks over and he sees this huge wave, and then it dawns on him, "I'm walking on the water." And then all of a sudden, "No, you're not." And he starts to sink, and he goes, "Lord, help me." And Jesus reaches out. We get distracted today, too. We get distracted during storms. Sometimes we get distracted when there are no storms, and the results are the same. We take our focus off Jesus, and we begin to sink. And the distractions that distract us are different than what Peter was facing. The waves that were choppy all around him. The distractions that distract us are false ways of trying to satisfy our soul. It's part of the world's strategy, the enemy's strategy, to bring our focus off of Jesus and to focus on something else. And I want to talk about a few of these. There's thousands of these distractions. I want to talk about three that I think are very relevant to our culture and us here in Hamburg, this part of our city. The first is pornography. I know you might be surprised by that, but pornography is one of the most significant and destructive ways that men are distracted from focusing on Jesus today. It is probably one of the single most destructive thing that is at work in our culture today. with regard, especially to men in their spiritual walk, men of any stripe, but certainly men who are men of God. With today's countless devices that we have to use to communicate, we have access to the internet at all times, almost, just about, which means pornography is available everywhere. In Steve Arterburn's book, Every Man's Battle, he writes this and why this is significant for men. Ladies, I'll just pull back the curtain just a little bit so you can understand a bit about this. But this is what Arterburn writes about men. He says, our eyes give men the means to sin broadly and at will. We don't need a date or a mistress. We don't even need to wait. We have our eyes and can draw sexual gratification through them at any time. We're turned on by female nudity at any way, shape, or form. And it's right there. And when the storms of life come, some men are turning that direction. And they think that is it's okay, it's just me, it's not going to affect anyone else. They think that. They're looking for something to satisfy them. Here's the truth. Regardless of the pressure that any man is facing, it doesn't justify escaping through pornography. In fact, you might ask yourself, why is someone looking in the sewer to find hope, to find meaning? The reality is it can affect anyone. And I'm just ringing the bell today. If it's you, you cannot do this alone. I don't know who it is, but I've had enough people in my office to say that the affair started with an addiction to pornography. You let it go long enough, you can't imagine the destruction that can come in your life. I don't stand here to judge you. I just want you to know the antidote is to keep your eyes on Jesus. When the storms come, these kinds of distractions will lead you to a life of failure and destruction spiritually. It doesn't have to be that way. And we want to help you. We want you to know that. The second distraction is materialism. Materialism is that distraction that says possessions will make you happy or they'll bring satisfaction. And there's nothing wrong with having nice stuff. Let me just say that right out of the gate. Where it becomes a problem is when we make it our focus, when it's all about the accumulation of those cool things, or those neat things. So we look to things to bring us contentment. And for a little while, let's be honest, you get a brand new motorcycle, there's something great about that. You get a brand new car, there's something awesome about that. You get a brand new house, a new jacket, new jewelry. For a little while. I don't know much about the jewelry thing, truthfully. But all the other stuff sounded pretty cool to me. For a little while, we have some contentment and some fun. But then it eventually wears off. The happiness is short-lived. Chuck Swindoll writes, he said, you can buy medicine, but you can't buy health. You can buy a house, but you can't buy a home. You can buy companionship, but you can't buy friends. You can buy entertainment, but you can't buy happiness. You can buy a bed, but you can't buy sleep. And you can buy the good life, but you can't buy eternal life. You can chase all those things. Materialism is just a distraction if we allow it to be. Look to Jesus. That's the antidote. Well, the third distraction I want us to look at, and as I said, there's thousands of these, but the third one might seem odd to some, and that is the distraction of success. Success right out of the gate seems harmless. Success is that idea that I just want to accomplish something. I want to do something that I'm good at, and I want to be recognized for it maybe. The truth is that there's nothing wrong with being successful unless it becomes what we're about. It becomes our focus. Success becomes a distraction when we make our life all about becoming successful. And if success is your focus rather than Jesus, then your pursuit of success is a distraction. And before you realize it, you will be sinking, or you may be soaring in this world, but in your relationship with God, you may be sinking. And that's a tough place to be. How do you manage that? Focus on Jesus. You see, these are just a few of the distractions, as I said, and there are many more that distract us and keep us from focusing on Jesus. Distractions can become the focus that defines you if you're not careful. If so, like Peter, we will find ourselves sinking. The minute you take your eye off Jesus and follow the distraction of pornography, you'll find yourself consumed by guilt and shame. And you'll wonder, how did I ever get there? Or if you follow the distraction of materialism, you'll find your credit cards maxed out and you're buried in a seemingly insurmountable amount of debt. You take your eyes off Jesus and you follow the distraction of success, and you'll arrive at the top of your field potentially, but you'll still have this empty feeling. You'll still have this sense of being unsatisfied. You thought topping out in your industry or in your area of expertise would make you feel better, but it didn't. These distractions will define us if we allow them to. Well, Jesus immediately reached out when Peter called, and he caught him. And then he said to him, "Why did you doubt?" See, the word doubt here carries the meaning of hesitation. It's the idea of being uncertain of which of two paths to take. And Peter balked, if you will. He was focused on Jesus, and then he saw the wind, and he realized there's two paths to go here. The one of walking on water with Jesus is not logical at all, or this one, the reality that this shouldn't happen. And he hesitated, and then he started to sink. You see, Peter started out of the boat with great faith, but he ended up with a lot less faith because he was distracted by the wind. What is it that distracts you?